Greetings, readers. I'm Audrey Chapuis, the director of the American Library in Paris, here to welcome you to Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. We are so honored to have Nita Wiggins here tonight to speak about her riveting memoir. And before we properly introduce her, I just want to say a few words about the library. You might know that we're situated in the 7th arrondissement, a stone's throw away from the Eiffel Tower, but you do not need to reside in Paris nor be American to enjoy the benefits of library membership. In fact, we have members from over 60 different nationalities, and many of whom do not reside in France. And they join us for many, many reasons: for virtual story hour, access to creative writing workshops, book groups, and access to our digital resources. We've got thousands of books, periodicals, magazines, newspapers like the New York Times. So we've been entirely community supported for over 100 years. So I'd like to thank every member and donor for making possible what we do. And thank you all for being here tonight. So back to Gabby. She's a member of the library team, here to introduce Nita.
Thank you, Audrey. So like Audrey said, tonight we're delighted to welcome Nita Wiggins and hear more about her new book, Civil Rights Baby, My Story of Race, Sports, and Breaking Barriers in American Journalism. In Civil Rights Baby, Wiggins delivers a timely memoir about her career on air and the competition she faced as a Black woman. Young and ambitious, Wiggins found herself doubting the protections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and questioning the field that once fed her childhood aspirations. After landing a position in Dallas and covering her beloved Cowboys, events came to a dramatic head and ultimately encouraged her move to France. Today, Nita lives in Paris, where she teaches at l'École Supérieure de Journalisme. Featured on Black Women in Europe's Power List of 2018, Nita works to empower young writers and encourages a diverse range of voices. Wiggins was a reporter and anchor in the US for 21 years, working for ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox affiliates. Today, in addition to her position at ESJ, Nita appears on France 24 and tends to her growing coaching program, Listen to Others. So Nita, thank you so much for joining us here tonight and for offering to speak to us a bit about your new book.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. I love interacting with library communities because that's where the readers are. And as a writer, the most important thing is to have a reader. In my comments tonight, I'm going to tackle two questions in particular, and then I would entertain your questions from the community. So the first question is, what in my life in the United States led me to move to France? And the second question that is often asked of Black Americans is, does a Black American have to migrate to succeed? So I'll tackle those, and I would want to hear your comments and reactions. The events on the day that I meet Mrs. Rosa Parks contribute in a significant way to the life that I have now in Paris. The title of my book, Civil Rights Baby, is an homage to Rosa Parks. Now, I meet her during an assignment when I'm working for a Columbus, Georgia television station. It's my job at that point to shoot the interview and to ask the questions. So I'm working alone. And I see Mrs. Parks standing alone before the ceremony. It was the renaming of a street to put her name on the street sign. When I see her in the flesh, I'm remembering immediately the books, the school books and the photographs. But because she is in front of me, I cannot help but walk toward her. In fact, I walk so close to Mrs. Parks that I am looking at her eyes through her eyeglasses. And she is unflinching. She looks at me warmly. I recognize that we are practically identical in height. And I prepare to extend my hand to to introduce myself and shake her hand. But then I shed my professional demeanor as if I'm stepping out of my clothes. And instead of offering my hand, I say to Mrs. Parks, "I never do this, but may I give you a hug?" She responds without hesitating, "Sure, baby." And she uses that lovely Alabama accent that I know so well because one of my grandmothers comes from Georgia. And it's quite ironic, but my other grandmother physically resembled Rosa Parks. So I'm standing there feeling as though both of my grandmothers are present with me. We embrace. And for someone 75 years old in 1988, Mrs. Parks has a remarkably powerful grip. She hugs me tightly, and I return that hug. And for me, the street sounds disappear. The children who are going to sing in the ceremony, their voices fade. The street sounds nothing. I am simply in the embrace of Mrs. Parks, and I'm breathing deeply, and she's breathing. Our hearts beat thump, 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 in unison and beside each other. And as I realize that maybe I've stepped over a professional limit by offering to give Mrs. Parks a hug, she continues to hug me, and I continue to hug her. I don't want to let her go. But then something tells me this is unprofessional. I have crossed a border, a frontier in a way. And when I release the mother of the civil rights movement, she is still holding me tightly. It is the ultimate moment of my life. I don't even know why she was so open and giving, but it meant so much to me. And it's a physical memory that I have kept with me my entire life. So when I write the book, of course, I have that episode as a major point, but Mrs. Parks reappears two other times. Now, one time she reappears in the early 2000s. I'm working in Dallas, Texas, and I'm covering the Cowboys, which had been my goal. And life is great. I'm traveling on the team plane with the team to go report on stories, to report on games. I'm staying in the team hotels with the team. Everything that I wanted in my career, I have at that point in Dallas, Texas. And for 9 years, I have it. But the frustration over the unending job bias has been wearing me down up until the days that I arrive in Dallas. And it's a heavy burden because for 20 years, I had been defending my qualifications. It started in 1989 with a news manager who told me I did not know anything about sports. From that point on, I'm defending my presence in my television jobs. And that's despite earning two prestigious broadcasting awards. So 20 years of this pushes me to the verge of throwing away all of the hard work, all of the good graces in my life, and all of the generous support from people in my life. So that moment comes, and as I'm in the final seconds before possibly ruining my life, Mrs. Parks reappears. But for me, she never really left me from that day in 1988. But at that moment, when I need rescuing, when I need support, the physical sensation of that hug comes back. Our skin on our cheeks touched because we were identical in height. And again, the heartbeat, the thump, 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 thump. So as I'm deliberating on that day that could ruin the rest of my life, I have to find a source to turn it all around. I had battled decades of job equality fights, but the vision and the physical presence of Mrs. Parks, along with other memories that swim back into my mind. For example, my father's hands-on approach for my entire life. That comes back to me. Going to my grandmother's church in Macon, Georgia in the 1980s, that swims back to me. At that time in the 80s, when I was already on television, I met people in my grandmother's church who said they never saw Black people on television in their early lives. And they said to me that the television news they would watch for the rest of their time was my channel because they knew a Black person who was working in that job. So these flashes come back to me, the support from people for the 2 decades that I had been in my fight. These flashes snap me out of my possible self-sabotage, but led by what I sensed as the physical presence of Mrs. Parks that day. It had been hard won for me to do what I did in television. I was a symbol to some people, as they would tell me when I would meet them at public events. I had become the journalist I told myself I would become when I was 12 years old. I was that girl journalist who went places not normal for girl journalists. I was that woman journalist who went places not normal for women journalists. I was that Black woman journalist who went places not normal for Black women. And I was that Black woman sports reporter who went places not the usual for women. And I was there because I armed myself with qualifications and certifications that male colleagues did not have to get, such as my boxing judge license and my basketball refereeing license. And I coached boxing, and I judged boxing matches, and I refereed basketball games. This was all in my armory so that I could insert myself and live with what should have been the protections of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed, the 1964 version was passed the year that I am born. But on that day, that I was seconds from erasing all of the good that had happened in my life, I was tired of the fight. Being a barrier breaker is a fight. And Mrs. Parks knew that. And so when I am stirred by those pinpricks of memories, part of that was Mrs. Parks' I would say belief that I would continue to break barriers. And she wanted to give me some form of motherly fortification as I faced my future battles. So on the day, as the seconds are winding down and I am about to make a disastrous decision, I halt myself. I instead formulate a new plan. I decide I have to break from what had been my childhood goal, the childhood vision I had of living out my career and retiring in Dallas. There probably comes a time for a lot of people when they realize that what they want will never be. And so as I cut loose of what I've realized would never be, it caused great pain to recognize that in the television industry in the United States, meritocracy rates so low, and that actually within the sports industry and the sports organizations, the athletes and the owners respected my merit and my qualifications more than my television managers. This is my experience. And as I wind down to the point of knowing that my career in Dallas will end, I have to look for something new because I have always been the kind of person to run toward something. That is what I do. I don't run from something. So in the early 2000s, I had started studying French so that I could report on the Tour de France and be a little bit autonome in my reporting. So when I shift from my childhood dream to my womanly career aspirations, France becomes my target. And like a lot of you, suddenly I am another American in Paris who realizes at some point that our vision of our life is going to be in France for some segment of our lives anyway. So I set my sights on that beacon of a journalism career without borders, but bringing me to France. And when I say without borders, it's that list that I mentioned before, the girl journalist who goes beyond, and all of those other levels as well. The best praise that I've gotten for Civil Rights Baby is from a reader who said that she finishes the book in 2 days. And she says she read so rapidly because she could not rest until the protagonist was in a safe landing. And throughout my life, I would say there have not really been safe landings. Having worked at 7 television stations, there was always some point 3 months, 6 months in where the new position was suddenly going to have to be the old position because I would have to pursue something else. And again, it's not for lack of job performance, I would say. And my record of interviews shows that, and my awards show that. But in some positions in television stations, when a woman is there and highly paid, she's a target with colleagues, and that had happened to me in a number of places. But that's why I was constantly on the move to improve my skills. And a reader from Kampala, Uganda, tells me that because of the many ways that I would add a skill or pursue something unexpected in the way of training or learning to speak French, though working in Texas, the reader from Uganda told me that the way I decided to change my life, to improve myself, to qualify for something else, she took inspiration from that and she took steps to improve her life. So those are two of the people whose comments have affected me quite deeply. When I started writing the book, I did not know what the theme would be. And I actually did not set out to write a memoir, but the president of my school, ESJ Paris, the president, Guillaume Jobin, said to me, Nita, you should write your story because your life within the American newsrooms would be a lesson for our journalism students. And he said also that a personal history could show a lot more than a textbook. So I wrote a memoir. And his quote is actually, "You were a Black woman on television in the United States in sports. I know you have a story to tell." And from that comes the theme of resilience. I always paralleled my life with what athletes had to do because my father was a volunteer coach in basketball and baseball and coached my brother's team for fun. And so I was always around the arena of sports where a person who might find that the skills are deficient might seek a new skill or would always be in training. And that's what I found my broadcasting career was. And so it becomes a story of resilience, at least when people tell me that that's what they take from it. And in the writing process, what I did was to list the emotional episodes of my life and then to write the details of the feelings, not just the narration, but the emotional impact that I felt with each of those encounters or episodes in my life. And I have to say that I had Marita Golden as a development editor, and she was crucial in pointing out some points of my story. I didn't give enough of the explanation. So the reader missed out on the motivation or the profound reaction that I had to something. And so for the people who tell me that they are moved by the descriptions, the details, and the emotion, I'd have to really say that the editor was key in making sure I did that, because this is the first book that I have written. I've been asked a number of times, did I ever wonder if I wouldn't be able to complete the memoir? And as I was getting to the end of the writing, I became deeply engaged in the story, more so than in the beginning of the writing process. But I became so engaged because I realize I'm writing an expose and that I'm telling the truth about the television industry. And so it's at that point that I realize, and I think about this quote that too long others have spoken for us. And it's the banner that John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish use on the mast of their newspaper. And they are the first Black people in the United States to publish a newspaper. And so when I'm nearing the end of the writing, and I'm wondering, will anything interrupt this project? I really began to worry that something unforeseen could stop the progress, and I would not be able to tell my own story in my own words, which had been the intent of the earliest Black publishers of newspapers. But I was able to write a 100% truthful expose. It is a whistleblower account of the television industry. And beyond that, it is my account as an African American woman of facing a constantly moving goalpost. And after that crucial event in the early 2000s, I decided to move my goalpost and to take myself out of that battle, selecting France as the place where I would try my new life. And so that brings me back to the question I asked early on. Does a Black American have to migrate to succeed? Well, at age 45, I relocate from Dallas to Paris. I had spent 21 years on American television, full-time employment. I covered America's team. I was in the homes of the superstar athletes, exclusive interviews. Even throughout my career, I was interviewing people in a way that my colleagues weren't. And after that 21 years, as I transitioned to the phase that I want next, because I'm seeking my next success, I come to France. I've been here now 11 years. And I have to say that 1 month ago, I reached a high point in my career, not only my US career, but my career in Europe. I moderated a panel discussion on sports as a catalyst for social justice. this was part of the Global Sports Week. And Global Sports Week was based in Paris, but we had continental hubs in Beijing, in Tokyo, in Dakar, in Los Angeles. And I am part of the broadcast team inside of the Eiffel Tower in the television studio set for the event. For me, that is a career high that I do not know I would have reached had I not left the United States. So, in addition to that fabulous event at the Eiffel Tower, I teach at ESJ, which is the oldest journalism only school in the world. And as Gabrielle did mention, I do appear on France 24 television. And I have a memoir that we are working on producing as an audiobook and an illustrated book. So, as I answer that question that I've been asked a number of times, yes, as a Black American, to have achieved these more recent successes, I had to be in France because my experience in the United States in my career has been that of what I call an economic lynching of a career, constant obstacles and constant retraining to hold on to a job. But this brings me back to Mrs. Parks also as I close, because she may have been signaling to me in 1988 that she saw in my career a payoff of her activism. She spent 70 years as an activist. She lived to be 92 years old. And had Mrs. Parks not been born in 1913, but had been born in 1963, almost at the time of my birth during the civil rights movement and as part of the civil rights generation, she and I could have been contemporaries together. But in her wisdom at age 75, when we embrace, I believe now that she was seeing that as a relay, and that motherly embrace and that heartbeat, those were the batons she was giving me to take forward wherever I would have the courage to go. And this brings me to my final comments before your questions, is that 5 months ago, in October 2020, I had the immense pleasure of visiting the namesake Lycée Rosa Parks in Montgeron, France. And not everyone knows that Mrs. Parks and her husband, Raymond Parks, did not produce children, but they did not. And so for me to have received that heartbeat, it was another success of my life to be able to visit her high school and take her heartbeat to the young people at her high school. And so the book, Civil Rights Baby, my story of race, sports, and breaking barriers, beyond being an expose, a whistleblower account of the television industry in the United States, that breaking barriers, I have come to realize, was Mrs. Parks within me coming to France. And it is another immense pleasure to be able to talk about the particulars of the book. And I will read just a section toward the end, because this is the third time that Mrs. Parks appears in Civil Rights Baby. Just as a mother full of affection might wrap arms around her child, so the mother of the civil rights movement embraced and held on to me. I am convinced that with this gesture, This history-making woman imbued me with some of her spirit, her iron will. Her will locked arms with my own unswerving personality. Rosa Parks never bore biological children, but when we released each other after that heart-infusing embrace, I had become a child of the movement she personified. It took nearly 30 years to germinate, but I now know how to grow the seeds of her precious gift. To do this, I capitalize on my platforms as international classroom instructor, public speaker, political essay writer, and television, podcast, and radio guest. In these places of influence, I cultivate the gift of activism that Mrs. Parks delivered to me. In line with her legacy, I focus on social justice concerns. I provide a perspective my students and other audiences in public spaces have not heard. They inform me of this. They say they welcome it. I feel good about this, but that was not always the case. For most of my life, I dreaded being singled out as the only Black person in a setting. Now I proudly wear the badge of being different, outwardly different. When I realize I am the sole representative of my demographic groups, I salute the work that Mrs. Parks and many other activists carried out. They succeeded in blasting away some of the stones that have blocked me in my right to self-fulfill. That is why I expose the violators who deny full freedom to others. This work of exposing is important, for abusers successfully subjugate and discriminate and humiliate because people are reluctant to talk about the wrongdoing. I am not reluctant. I talk. With this book, with my story, I talk. So I thank you for listening, and I appreciate having this avenue of the American Library in Paris to connect and to share.
Nita, thank you so much for being so vulnerable with us tonight and for sharing that last piece. I see someone clapping.
Thank
so
you.
really, a round of applause. And I'm already receiving questions. So for anyone who has additional questions, go ahead and post them in the chat now. I've already received some.
Okay.
So Nita, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and start the Q&A.
Yes, please.
So we have questions. So you talked about the importance of migrating as a Black woman and finding your career heights elsewhere. Are you optimistic about the future of women of color in journalism, or do you think there will still be, this obligation, this necessary move?
I fear that there will always be an extra hurdle, another obstacle, whether we talk about hair or we talk about the clothes that are worn, or we talk about body image. I don't see that going away, unfortunately. But the advice that I would offer is that what I did because it worked for me, and it was part of what I learned from my father in that hands-on, hand in glove way that my father led me through so many things in my life. Often when I faced a setback or a failure, I heard my father's voice telling me, figure out what you can do about it. The complaint, one must sound off and let people know when they are discontent. But in the long run, one must act to improve his or her situation. But initially, the question, I do fear that women of color will continue to face more bias than others. And if I would change that if I could. All I can change is myself. and I can offer the advice and the support and guidance as I do to help others to find the ways that they need to go forward.
And I have to say, again, I told you before we even started this event that I'm a little selfish, so I'm going to push my own question here. But
Okay.
I have to say, you spoke in your book. I have the library copy here. I promise everyone who's watching, I'm going to return it tomorrow.
Okay.
You spoke about how much you love NASCAR. Okay.
Mm.
And you just gave the speech about, you know, places not for Black women.
Mhm.
Now, personally, and I mean, I think in June, there was a New York Times article
Mhm.
about NASCAR, specifically about Daryl Wallace Jr., about Bubba.
Yes, Bubba. Mhm.
For those who aren't familiar with NASCAR, I don't know if there's many Parisians familiar with NASCAR, so I'm going to go ahead and explain. Daryl Wallace Jr., he's a new up and coming Black driver. And after the George Floyd incidents last summer, began to be more forward about his stances and his belief in the Black Lives Matter movement. And since then, there's been a conversation about NASCAR, this place where before, I mean, you know, it's a place where you could see Confederate flags waving.
Mhm.
So my question for you, Nita,
Mhm.
is how do you navigate these spaces? These spaces you love, but that come with this conflict.
Mhm. My father's favorite chapter is the NASCAR chapter. And to me, that shows the universality of something like NASCAR. And there are family lines. There are grandfathers now who have sons who, grandfathers who raced cars in NASCAR, who have grandsons who have become race car drivers. So for my father and for me, the interest in NASCAR as we were living in Georgia came from those family lines. And when I write about the Earnhardt family in the book, I write about Dale Earnhardt Sr. and the way that he shields his son, Junior, as we called him, after Junior wins a 500-mile race. And so for me and for my father, that was the illustration of the way a father molded a child who succeeded in the career of his choice. And that is the beauty of that NASCAR chapter and generally of NASCAR. Now, the racial component of it, I was watching NASCAR races at age 4. And so by the time that I'm working at television stations and I must cover the race, I know all of the families. I know the grandpa, the son, and the grandson. And because I spoke with intelligence and preparation and skill about NASCAR, the drivers embraced me when I was asking questions. Again, in my career, the racial problems and the gender-based problems that I had came from the people working in journalism, not the people on location and competing in the sporting events. I know there have been misogynistic things and race-related things said by athletes. I did not witness or experience those things coming at me.
So let's go back to France then,
Mhm.
because I'm curious. I really like this term. I liked how you talked about the constantly moving goalpost, and you're in a constant battle with this, right?
Mhm.
Do you think that the post moves less often in France, or how do you find the experience here? Because I mean, it's a difficult conversation, right? And I myself, as another Black American here in France, I agree that I felt this motivation to migrate, but I know I can't say with full honesty that, you know, there aren't similar problems here. So how have you found journalism in France for women of color?
Yes, there are similar problems as far as who has limits. and who has to prepare more. I do find that in France and the United States are similar in that way. Uh, Fortunately, I'll say two things. Fortunately, with my career and my specialties, because my background is unique on purpose by design, I when I pitch a story or an interview on to different media representatives, I do get a call back. Part of that comes from having a good idea to pitch. And the other part of that comes from being a Black American and not a Black person from another part of the world. Like, for example, friends who are highly skilled and highly trained and capable of speaking about their issues, who come from the West Indies, do not get the same interview opportunities that I get. I've even had the pleasure of being invited to speak in French on some different media platforms. But I don't speak French as well as my wonderful friends who come from the West Indies, yet they are not invited. And so the barriers that existed for me in the United States, I do feel there are parallel barriers here for people who are not Black Americans, who are Black people from other parts of the diaspora.
And I have another question here. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for that answer. It was so comprehensive. So thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
And
Okay.
someone just asked, have your students and colleagues embraced NFL football? So I think we should broaden that. We talked a little bit about NFL before the NFL before tonight's event kicked off, but NFL, what are your thoughts now that you're living in France? Do your colleagues embrace it? I think you could look at this from different angles. So I'm going to leave that open for you.
I'll talk about my students. I have taught over 1,100 students in my 11 years. And my students have come from at least 30 nationalities that they have identified and that we've talked about. So I speak with facts, okay? So these are my numbers. 1,100 students. I hope I didn't say 11,000 the first time, but 1,100 students and 30 or 35 nationalities. I have had exactly 3 students who have been interested in American football, 3 out of 1,100. But the ones who do follow American sports, because I do give that assignment in my sports classes, the ones who do follow American sports tell me what they like is that there are no hooligans in the stands, as we have seen in European stadiums. And so that's generally how they talk about American football. And I myself have stopped watching it because of the concussions that we now have medical proof of, and that the teams can no longer deny that the concussions with severe problems are happening to NFL players.
Okay. There's a follow-up asking for your favorite team. So maybe what was your favorite team to cover?
Well, the Dallas Cowboys, because the marketing affected me. Growing up in Georgia, we had the Atlanta Falcons football team, and we had a football team in Florida that was not very good. Funny thing, it's called the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that just won the Super Bowl. But I would see 2 teams on my local television watching with my father, but 2 teams that did not impress me. But when the Dallas football game was on our television later in the evening on Football Sunday, the Cowboys were spectacular. They had the white star and the blue and white logo. And so as a child at age 8, I became attracted to the marketing of America's team. And I was going to go there and be a reporter until retirement.
I can say I have also fallen for the Dallas Cowboys marketing. I grew up with, I forget the name of the show. Do you want to be a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader? It was a
Okay.
reality show. I was enamored with it when I was a
Wow.
child. But we have a couple more questions here. So
Hmm.
someone's curious if you know about the Rosa Parks Gym in the 14th arrondissement.
I know there are some dance lessons at a location, and it's called the Rosa Parks Recreation Center. I don't know if that's the same place, but I will check that out.
And then we also have, do you ever consider moving back to the US to teach students there, be a part of the dialogue there, and share your experience?
I haven't considered that at this point because when there is a topic such as the death of Muhammad Ali, and those who've read my book know that I spent 4 days in the professional entourage of Muhammad Ali. So an event like that means that my experience is of value to interviewers or television stations or news programs in France. If I were in the United States, there are other people with the same or better calling cards as far as connecting to a news peg or a news event. So I prefer being in France at this point. And I have to say that the position I had at ESJ, I've had anchor men and anchor women in my master's classes who are on television in their countries, in coming from Algeria, Senegal, Cameroon, DRC. I've had students from Mongolia. I've had students from Palestine. And because of the way that I teach my course, everyone, no matter what level of respect they had for each other, even a high level, they respect and learn more about each other because of the way I teach my course. And I'm not ready to give that up because I feel that I'm having an impact in places all around the world where I might have less of an impact if I were doing the same program, teaching the same program in the United States.
That's It's a good point. And it's part of what brought me to France as well. I mean, when I wanted to get my master's degree, I liked the multiculturalism of it all, which
Mhm,
of course you get in the United States, but
mhm.
feeling so connected to the world here on the Mediterranean, like you said, reporters in Algeria,
Yes.
reporters coming
Mhm,
from Southeast Asia,
mhm.
just that connection. We also have a question asking to revisit your relationship with your father. So you talked a bit about the role your father played in your love of sports, your love of NASCAR. What role would you say your father played in getting you to where you are today?
That's the book. Oh, well, let
Read the
me just
book.
no, then I'll summarize something just to add to that. Ah, well, again, um, I my father, when I was visiting back in the US about 3 years ago, before the book was a printed version, I had simply the manuscript, and I read the entire manuscript to my father. And I would read a couple of chapters and I'd say, "Okay, are you ready to stop?" He'd say, "No." And so for me to answer what part did he play in my life, uh, all of it, all of it. But in asking him what affected him the most in the book, it was the Earnhardt NASCAR chapter because of the universality of how a father shows a child something and the child embraces it or not. So I'll have to leave it with that there.
And did your mother play a role?
Of course, people ask me that. Of course, my mother was not interested in sports. And because I was so super focused on sports, I was more beside my father on the entire weekend watching sports. My sister was with my mother. But one thing that my mother really did do, I remember she had an idea of wanting to add a window in the breakfast room adjacent to the kitchen. And my mother was a stay-at-home mom. And she says to my father, let's do this, let's do this. My father says, no, can't be done. One particular day, my father goes off to work, and my mother goes from the kitchen to the backyard carrying a butcher knife. And I'm wondering what's going to happen with this butcher knife. My mother spent that morning chiseling out the cement around a brick in the space of the breakfast room to show my father that it could be done, that the brick wall could be partially knocked out and a window installed. And so I had the example of a mother who decided when something was going to be done, that it was going to be done. And it has been an invaluable lesson to have that input from my mother.
That lesson definitely comes through in your book, 100%. So I guess I want to end on a literature question, if that's all right with you. I think it's just fitting here with the American Library in Paris. Someone asked if you've been influenced or inspired by any of the American writers who are also expatriates here in Paris, James Baldwin, Richard Wright. Have you been reading any writers of similar situations, or have you been inspired by them?
Yes. So Ralph Ellison, early on in writing my book, I was gathering responses, getting feedback from readers. And one reader wrote back that she felt my book early on was like the Invisible Man, like Invisible Man by Ellison. And I was, wow, that was, it really rocked my world as someone who was starting to write a book to have that comparison. So I immediately got a copy of Invisible Man because I had to know what those similarities were. And the same person said that Civil Rights Baby reminded her of The Metamorphosis by Kafka. So I had to get that book and read it as well. And I now have on my shelf Richard Wright. Here's my Ellison. But I have a collection of Ellison short stories. And I've been reading these just periodically. And I have a Richard Wright reader. But their writing, Richard Wright in particular, has not affected my book because I wrote my book before I started reading Richard Wright. But Ellison, I come from the South, I come from Georgia, and some of the short stories of the brutality and the physical violence against Black people, that is the subject matter in a lot of the stories. And because that's constantly on our televisions, I backed away from reading too much more of it because I tried to reduce having so much of that input.
Well, gosh, Nita, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I think that's such a great point to end on. Combining literature with your story, what you've taken from it, what you steered on your own. And you've been so vulnerable here with us sharing your story. I think being a memoirist is one of the most exposing things you can do, and vulnerable positions you can be in. So I thank you for sharing not only tonight with us, but your story. And I hope to meet you in person sometime soon at the library.
I promise we'll do that. Yes.
I look forward to it.